Good morning, Junior 5. How are you today? Let's start with lesson 2, which is called Applications of Frictions. In the previous lesson, you have learned that the friction force always acts in the direction opposite to the direction of motion, acts in the opposite direction of the movement. And the friction force is based on the friction between two surfaces when the two surfaces touch each other. When any two surfaces touch each other, so there is a type of force. This type of force called the friction force, and it slows down or even stops the motion. There are a lot of technological applications based on the friction between two surfaces that are in contact. In this lesson, we are going to study the advantages of the friction force or the benefits of the friction force and the disadvantages of the friction force. Let's start with the advantages of the friction force or the benefits of the friction force. Number one, the friction force between the car tires and the road helps the car to move forwards. So this is benefit of friction. Number two, the car brakes. It's a tool in the car that used to slow down or stop the car. This tool depends on the friction between the car tires and road. So if you need to stop or slow down the car speed, so you move or you use the car brakes to stop this car. So it depends on the friction between the car tires and roads. If there will be no friction between the car tires and road, so you cannot stop the car. Number three, the friction enables or help us to control the car speed. The friction help us to control the car speed and it change its direction, to change the car directions. So this is advantages or benefits from the friction. Number four, the frictions help us to walk. The frictions help us to walk and the friction between our shoes and the ground that prevent us from slipping down. Because they prevent us from slipping down. The friction between your shoes and the road prevent us from slipping down. Number five, the friction is needed for lighting the match. The friction is needed for lighting up the match. Why? Because the friction generates heat. That allows the match to heat up and start burning. So the lighting of the match needs friction to generate heat that allow the match to heat up and start burning. This is the advantages of the friction. Let's recap. What are the advantages of the friction? The friction force or the friction between the car tires and road help the car to move forward. The friction helps to control the car speed to change its direction. The car brakes depend on the friction to stop or slow down the car. And the friction between your shoes and the ground prevent you from slipping down. So the friction helps us to walk. And lightening match needs friction. Lightening up the match needs frictions. This is the advantage of the friction. So what are the disadvantages? What are the disadvantages of the friction force? The friction between the internal moving parts of the machines. There are friction between the internal moving parts. The parts of any machines like washing machines. The friction between the internal moving parts of the washing machines causes rises in their temperature. If their temperature rises up to more than certain limit, there is a certain limit of this temperature, If the temperature rises to more than certain limit, the moving part of the machines are damaged. And so a lot of money is wasted. So continuous cooling is needed to protect the internal parts of the machines from damages. Why? Because the internal moving part of the machines causes the rises in their temperature. Like when you rub your hands, if any two objects touch each other and start moving, so there is a rise in their temperature. So if their temperature rises up to more than certain limit, the moving parts will damage. The moving parts of these machines are damaged, and a lot of wastes or a lot of money is wasted. So this is disadvantages of the friction. So the continuous cooling is needed to protect the internal parts of the machines from damage. So engineers design machines in proper way to decrease the friction between their internal moving parts to increase their efficiency. So the disadvantages of the friction, because the friction causes a rise in their temperature. But if their temperature rises up to more than certain limit, so the moving parts of the machines are damaged and a lot of money is wasted. Okay? Now give reason. They also give reason. The friction causes damage to most of the machines. Why? Why the friction force causes damage to most of the machines? Because it rises the temperature of the internal moving parts to more than a certain limit. So these machines are damaged. So a lot of money is wasted. So the engineers must design the machines in a proper way to decrease the friction between their internal moving parts. Okay, so these machines need continuous cooling to protect their internal moving parts from damage. This lesson is finished. It's a very, very easy lesson. Thank you, Junior 5.